He was the CEO of American Promise, which is an organization, he'll tell you more about it, an organization that's really working to think about the issue that came up in the last talk, money in politics. What happens when you, particularly in a country like the United States, when you have legal rules and legal protections that then protect in what's become now unlimited amounts of money contributions in politics, what kind of political movement can we have to try to change that? Jeff has been doing this for a long time, so it's a real honor to have him here to talk about the work that he's been doing and a way forward for us. Elliot is going to come and talk. His background is actually in development, but he's been doing some interesting work here that he's going to talk about with the DNC. So he started an organization in development called YGEN, and it's Y Generation Against Poverty. So it's a development organization. He wasn't able to join us yesterday when we had a panel of NGOs talking about the work that they're doing to address inequality globally and locally. But he is also now in the United States doing work with the Democratic National Committee and preparing a forum actually that's coming up with presidential candidates. So he's going to talk a little bit about the broader context and contemporary political issues in the U.S. after Jeff has his presentation. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody. How are you? Good to see you here at Yale. Thank you, Attorney General, Professor Felipe. Excellent presentations. I don't have a slideshow, so you just have me. I wanted to make 3 points today. Number one, I want to share something about our system in America at the moment, and particularly around systemic corruption, as opposed to bribery and the kind of corruption that the Attorney General talked about, but the corruption of our entire system because of certain constitutional decisions that our Supreme Court has made. And then second, and the news will get better as the talk goes on, because number two is, second, we have a solution, but it's really hard. It's an amendment to our U.S. Constitution to tell the Supreme Court that they were wrong, they made a mistake, and enable us to get a handle on the systemic corruption, because in our view at American Promise, overcoming extreme inequality in the economic sphere requires that we overcome extreme political inequality, and we have to put our equal rights as citizens back into the Constitution to do that, because the Supreme Court has taken that right, that equal right out. So that's number two. We could fix it with a constitutional amendment. And number three, although it's really hard and rare that we do constitutional amendments, this question we're talking about, whether the political equality of Americans and our not only right but duty to check the leveraging of massive economic power into political power, that's the whole story of America. That's why we're called American Promise. That many of our constitutional amendments, our whole constitutional narrative, is about fulfilling political equality. And that will enable us to overcome enable us, it won't alone solve extreme inequality. It will give us the power and the ability to do some of the hard work to solve other forms of extreme inequality. So those are the 3 points. So we start with number one. We've heard some different aspects of the problem today, from media and fake news and how that is sort of corrupting of the citizenry, getting adequate information to make informed decisions. We've heard corruption of the kind of massive pay-to-play or bribery kind of corruption. Now, I am from Boston, so I can tell you, in the 1930s, our mayor won re-election from his jail cell in Boston. We get corruption. Remember the FBI scandal of Whitey Bulger, and a guy who was allowed to basically run the town like a mafioso, except because he was Irish mafia, he was protected by the FBI for years. Our last 3 leaders of our House of Representatives have gone to federal penitentiaries. So far, the 4th one is so far so good, but Sal DeMacy, our last one, went almost literally after getting bags of cash for government contracts. Instead, it was paid to his law firm. So I get that kind of corruption. I was in the chief of the Public Protection Bureau in our Attorney General's office, so it was nice to compare notes on that. I want to talk about a different kind of corruption, though, today, and that's the systemic corruption, the corruption of our process by unlimited money in our political system, how it happened. So let's talk about that definition of corruption, though, first, because you know, the corruption that allows the super wealthy or global corporations to have so much political power that they can buy, you know, election outcomes, they can buy policy, they can prevent reform from happening, they can do so much because of the way money is able to dominate the political system. Is that corruption? Well, not really if your system is an aristocracy or plutocracy. You talk about the plutocratization. If our system was plutocracy, and that is, you know, there's been many human societies organized around allocating political power by wealth. That's not corrupt if that's what the goal is, right? So, you know, our revolution was against a class-based aristocracy where political power was allocated by wealth. You know, it's not corrupt to buy a really expensive car. It might be tacky, it might be excessive, there might be lots of things. But even though it's unequal, if I can only buy a used Volkswagen, we don't think of it as corrupt. But if you're buying policy, buying elections, having undue influence, using your economic might to get political advantage, I think almost all Americans, except 5 Supreme Court justices, say that's corrupt. You know, that's corrupt because, you know, Deborah Hellman, a law professor some of you might know, says corruption is a derivative concept. It derives from a vision of what isn't corrupt, right? So if it's not corrupt in an aristocracy, but it is corrupt to most of us, why? Because it's a definition that we think we are equal citizens. And it's wrong to use your wealth to take our equal right to be heard, to participate, and to have a voice in our political system, to be represented. So that's the systemic corruption that the court has basically mandated, required, imposed on us. You know, if we were equal citizens, where every American had a reasonably equal right to be heard, to be represented in Congress or our state legislatures, to have our ideas matter, maybe to run for office, as Sue Johnson and these folks over here and others maybe among you have done. Our system would have certain features, right? You would be one person, one vote. You know, the fact that you were a millionaire or a billionaire would give you an advantage or a megaphone in the system. We'd be able to check that to make sure that we were actually vindicating the equal rights of Americans to run or be heard or be represented. But that isn't our system. If you look at what we actually have, it's much more like plutocracy or oligarchy than democracy. We'll just give you some statistics on that. Many of you probably know the study, or you should, by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page out of Princeton and Northwestern. Americans basically have a statistically zero correlation between whether the ordinary person wants a particular policy outcome and whether it happens or not. And the only time we get policy that most Americans want is if it happens to correlate with what a wealthy class wants. So, you know, they've digested a ton of data. You can look at the whole study. But basically, we have a statistically zero influence in our political system as ordinary citizens. So that's one factor. We have had $60 billion since the Supreme Court struck down our campaign finance laws in 2010 in the case of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. $60 billion has been spent in elections. Voter turnout is low. Satisfaction of candidates is abysmal. I used to say the only thing more unpopular than Congress was lawyers, but that's no longer true. Thank you, Congress. They're now the least popular and disrespected institution probably we have, the direction of the country generally. And here's this, 80% of Americans now agree that corporate political system, corporate political spending in our elections, and the corruption of money in our political system means their, quote, vote does not matter because of the influence that wealthy individuals and big corporations have on our political system. That's findings from Pew and many others. You can just probably go ask anybody in the street. Most people feel like the dominant influence in our political systems are wealthy corporations. So, the difference though with Brazil is this is completely legal. Nobody can prosecute these cases. There's absolutely nothing illegal about this corruption, and that's why it's systemic corruption. So not only is it illegal, and let me just say one other stat, just to give you a sense of this. $60 billion has been spent. Almost all of that money comes from less than 1% of the American population. And it happens at every level. The state parties now completely dominated by money. Almost all the money from a handful of wealthy donors. And so it's a massive influence of wealth on our political system. And not only is it completely legal, we aren't allowed to pass any laws to fix it. Because the Supreme Court has said this isn't corruption. This is free speech. So not only is it not illegal, it's lifted up as some constitutional beauty thing that we should celebrate. It's just lots of free speech. That's the Supreme Court theory. That's how they broke America, really. And so how did it happen? I might go fast. So just, I know we have people from all around the world, and I often will say, "Oh, Citizens United," like everybody knows what that means. And even Americans don't know what Citizens United means. So when you're out there saying "overturn Citizens United," I should tell you, we did a focus group, that Citizens United is a big Supreme Court case. It held corporations have the same rights as people. So corporations can spend unlimited money to influence the elections. Trillions of dollars of global capital potentially unleashed. Money is just free speech, so if it's not in a campaign, but through a so-called independent expenditure, like a super PAC, we can't touch it. They define corruption, only quid pro quo corruption. Here's a bag of cash, go do this for me. But if you say, here's $100 million, that's illegal still. If you say, here's $100 million in a super PAC that will say Jeff for Senator all over every news outlet and then drive a whole bunch of fake news onto social media, you're going to win the election because we're going to spend $100 million. And by the way, we'd really like an oil pipeline through your state. That's perfectly legal right now. Because the Supreme Court and Citizens United said, that's not quid pro quo corruption. That's free speech, right? I know it's bewildering probably to other countries. It is to Americans too. But we did a focus group on Citizens United. Most people thought it was an insurance company. So better to talk about the substance of the issue, because every American gets that, than to get all wonky on the legal names of the cases. But I wanted to say 4 Supreme Court cases, because I think of them as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Number 1, Citizens United versus Federal Election did what I just said. Struck down the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act and said refused to limit corporate money in elections, and union money for that matter. Struck it down, said that's a free speech violation, a violation of our First Amendment. Did all those things I said. Redefined corruption, said that our rights as equal citizens have zero balance when you're weighing whether a law should be constitutional in the First Amendment free speech balance, because it might limit money, but it lifts up, allows people who don't have money to be heard. no, the Supreme Court says political or equal rights don't count. At Citizens United 2010, a year or two later, Arizona Free Enterprise PAC, the case that came out of Arizona, where they had public financing as Connecticut did, and Maine, and a couple of other states. In response to all the money that Citizens United now dumped into our political system, some states like Connecticut and Arizona and Maine said, well, we will have a public funding system for candidates, and if millions of dollars come in, we'll allow a little more money for the public funded candidates to be heard. Supreme Court said, struck that down, said that violates the rights of the rich people who are trying to buy the election if the government is allowing them to be heard. I'm paraphrasing, but only barely. Only barely. In this oral argument in the Supreme Court, in that case, Chief Justice Roberts looked at the Assistant Attorney General from Arizona, who was arguing the case for Arizona about why that law is perfectly good. And the Chief Justice had gone to the Arizona Election Commission website, and on the website it said this law is intended to help level the playing field. Right? That sounds okay, right? Let's level the playing field for Americans. But the Chief Justice said to the Assistant Attorney General, it says you're trying to level the playing field. Right there. Why doesn't that prove that this is unconstitutional? Right? And the reason he's saying that is because in the Supreme Court's jurisprudence, trying to get equal rights to be heard is actually a violation of the First Amendment. Because there is a right to drown out other people with money. That's what the ideology of Citizens United is. So, Arizona Free Enterprise PAC, the second, horseman of the apocalypse, struck down those state laws that tried to do a level playing field and lift up other candidates.
2012? Is that
right around 20, all these happened between 2011 and 2014, so right in that time period. Third Grim Reaper horseman was a case out of a federal case involving, it was called McCutcheon. You might have heard of McCutcheon for the lawyers, but there used to be a law for decades that said there was a limit on the aggregate amount of money you could give to federal candidates, those running for Congress across the country, because they didn't want corporations and billionaires buying the entire party of Congress. So the limit was $123,000. That was the limit. And a CEO of a coal mining engineering company said that violated his free speech rights. So court agreed. That law was struck down. So now you have, I know many of you felt like you weren't able to speak because you had to stop at $123,000 with your federal contributions to candidates. But you are now free at last. You can spend $1 million plus, whatever you want, to buy Congress. So that was the third one. And again, all these relate to that same, remember the ideology of Citizens United. That isn't quid pro quo corruption, because you're just giving lots of contributions to lots of people, so it can't be corrupting. It's free speech. And so that as they apply that theory, it ripples out in all these ways. So that's number 3. $123,000 limit on contributions violates free speech, struck down, even though it's been for decades. Now here's in some ways the worst one. American Tradition Partnership versus Bullock. Steve Bullock is now running for president. He was governor of Montana. At the time, he was Attorney General of Montana. Montana had a law that went back 100 years to the last Gilded Age to say corporations had to stop buying the Montana Senate, and because basically Montana at the time was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Anaconda Copper Corporation, and the people rose up, passed by the ballot initiative a law that said no corporate money in elections. American Tradition Partnership is like one of those wonderful things that it was mostly not American, it was global corporations. It was not at all traditional. Maybe it was a partnership, but it was one of those, Americans for Apple Pie super PACs that wanted to spend millions or even billions, whatever it took, to get all the resources of Montana controlled by controlling Montana politics. So Steve Bullock defended the law. I filed a brief in the case on his behalf. We won in the Montana Supreme Court 8-1. Montana Supreme Court said, this law is perfect, we need this law for anti-corruption. Went up to the Supreme Court. Now 25 states had similar laws. I think maybe Connecticut, I know Massachusetts did. It's called the Corrupt Practices Acts. The states around the country passed them back, and that's what helped end the Gilded Age to make our democracy function again. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and they didn't even give it a hearing. Attorney General Bullock didn't get to argue with the Supreme Court. Summary reversal of the Montana Supreme Court with no hearing, saying, we know what you're doing, Montana. You're trying to get around Citizens United, but no, you can't. And they struck down all the state anti-corruption laws that had stood for 100 years. So this is new. It's radical. So those are the four horsemen, and there's more coming of the apocalypse. And it's apocalyptic for American democracy because think of the results. New Hampshire's Senate, U.S. Senate election in 2016, New Hampshire has 700,000 voters. It cost $132 million. One Senate race. Almost all that money came from outside of New Hampshire. Almost all that money came in the form of $1 million, $100,000, $500,000 contributions to super PACs with nice names, like Granite State Solutions. New Hampshire is the Granite State. I asked people when I was in New Hampshire, anybody ever heard of Granite State Solutions? I looked it up. It was formed in Atlanta, Georgia, right before the election. And then they got $100 million and they used it to start buying state Senate races, and U.S. Senate races. So that's why we're losing the system. This is only 9 years after Citizens United, $130 million races for Senate. That's systemic corruption. It's not one candidate. It's not one donor. It's the corruption of the political process so that the voters don't have a real voice. And when the election's over, they don't have a real representative. That the donors are the ones represented now. And that's why things don't get done. That's why we don't solve problems in this country anymore. So if you saw the pathway to how we got here, it was a constitutional choice by the Supreme Court, making decisions that basically built a framework of making inequality a constitutional virtue, right? Making it impossible for us to actually achieve anything about equal rights for citizens in our political process, because that would violate the First Amendment according to the Supreme Court. So that's the problem, as I see it. I would not doubt, because of the stakes, the people didn't care about New Hampshire. They didn't spend $130 million because they particularly thought New Hampshire was interesting. They cared about control of the U.S. Senate. And that's happening in Maine now. Susan Collins wins or loses, Senator Collins. That may decide which party controls the U.S. Senate. There are trillions of dollars at stake with that outcome. If we do anything about climate change in America, that's billions and maybe trillions of dollars of significance. If Mitch McConnell is the Senate Majority Leader, it will make a difference about whether we do anything. I would not be surprised to see $500 million Senate races in 10 years. There's that much at stake that there's no end to this unless we do something as Americans, and our beloved friends from Brazil and Kenya and elsewhere cheering us on. But it's up to us to get a constitutional amendment, to put equality back in the First Amendment, to put anti-corruption principles back in the First Amendment. And I say back in because they were always there. The Supreme Court has done what Jim Leach, a former congressman from Iowa, a Republican, he called it the genetic modification of our democratic DNA. That's what's happened. It's actually been a modification to strip equality and anti-corruption out of our Constitution. So, good news, there's an amendment to put it back in. It's HJ Res 2, Resolution 2. It's been introduced in the Congress. There are other variations on it, and we'll get the best language. Congressman Hines is actually one of many, many sponsors of this amendment. And it says, to advance democratic self-government and political equality, and to protect the integrity of government and the electoral process, Congress and the states may regulate and set reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money by candidates and others to influence election. Section 2. Congress and the states shall have the power to implement and enforce this article by appropriate legislation and may distinguish between natural persons and corporations or other artificial entities created by law. That will be in the Constitution. Words like that. I'm willing, and I am putting money on it, that it will be in the Constitution by July 4th, 2026, 6 years from now, if we do our job. And that's the good news. Let me tell you why I believe this so much. Congressman Hines is not alone. There's close to 200 supporters of this amendment. In America, we need to pass a constitutional amendment, 2/3 of Congress, that's 290 House members, and 67 senators, and then it has to go through in our federalist system. 3/4 of the state legislatures need to ratify this amendment. So at American Promise, we're actually bringing Americans together across partisan lines to make this happen. 20 states, including Connecticut, have now passed formal resolutions in favor of this amendment. If you think they're all like Connecticut, you're wrong. We just passed the Wyoming House, almost all Republican. We passed in Montana, partly because of that case, which is a Republican, more or less, state. 75% of people in Montana voted in favor of this in a ballot initiative. We passed Colorado, 75%. The latest one was just New Hampshire after that election I told you about, state number 20. We have Olympia Snow, Al Simpson on the Republican side, Nina Turner, Mike Dukakis on the Democratic side, many more. Millions of Americans. It polls at about 80%. And so the challenge is to drive this through our political system. How are we going to do that? Well, there's this counterpart of this amendment. It's not only in the House, it was introduced in the Senate. I was there on the Supreme Court steps with Tom Udall from New Mexico, the senator who introduced it. That day, 47 senators signed on to do this. We need 67, we need 20 more. But all the Democrats signed on. Independents, Angus King from Maine, moderate independents signed on. Mitch McConnell is holding an iron leash around his caucus, so that's an issue. But we think we can get Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Cory Gardner, Ben Sass, and other Republicans in the next couple of years. And we have a strategy in those states, a state-based grassroots strategy that's about letting Republican voices be heard, so Republican elected officials are forced to get behind this or be defeated. That's what's happening. Now, final bit of good news, and I can answer lots of questions about the strategy if you want. I said this is part of the American constitutional narrative. I want to close with that. Remember the stakes here. The question is not campaign finance. It's not even corruption. The stakes are whether we are equal as human beings and citizens. Because the Supreme Court says we're not. The Supreme Court says if you're rich, if you have a corporate treasury, you're more equal. You get to use it for more rights, and more voice, and more power in the political process. That question about whether we're equal or not is the one that defines the whole American experience. We have 27 amendments so far. And if you look at, that's our national story. People talk about original intent. What did the framers think? All that. I have a constitution. I have extras. Anybody wants a pocket constitution? If you open it up, half of this wasn't written in Philadelphia. It wasn't written by, old guys in wigs. It was written by the American people. 27 amendments. Bill of Rights. Dred Scott decision said African Americans can't be citizens ever. And it took 3 amendments to reverse that. 13th, 14th, and 15th. And a civil war and 700,000 Americans died. That's how much we value getting this question. To use a legal term, sometimes we suck. We still want to say, no, we're better than that. And we're going to go through a lot of pain to deliver on this promise that we're actually supposed to be equal citizens. Women getting the right to vote. Nobody remembers the slogan, overturn Minor versus Happersett. Like you hear overturned versus Citizens United versus FEC. Minor versus Happersett was a Supreme Court case when the court, like in Dred Scott, said, well, no, we don't really mean that crazy equal thing. They got carried away in the revolution, but no, that's not us. Women have no right to vote. That was the decision of the Supreme Court. It took a long time to struggle in the 19th Amendment to say women have a right to vote. The Supreme Court said that you can't have a progressive income tax. Constitutional amendment said yes, we can. The Supreme Court said 18, 19, 20-year-olds can be drafted, conscripted into the military, sent to Vietnam, and have no right to vote. 26th Amendment gave the right to vote, took the right to vote for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. The Supreme Court said there's nothing wrong with a poll tax, an economic barrier. That's exactly what we have right now. An economic barrier to full participation as a citizen in our political system. The Supreme Court said a poll tax is fine, a tax on voting, even if that means millions of Americans don't vote and can't vote. The 24th Amendment said, no, you're wrong again. So when we win this 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it will be the 9th time the American people kind of dusted off our constitutional, skills, which we really do have, because most of us get this, no matter our differences. 9th time that we did this and reversed and nullified and shamed Supreme Court decisions that denied our equal rights. And so that's what I'd suggest to you, that our systemic corruption is corruption, but ultimately the reason it's corrupt is because it deprives us of equal rights to govern ourselves together as equal citizens, which is the whole point of the American experiment. And now the global human experiment, this struggle to actually have equality of rights and effective self-government. And it has always been true. The biggest risk to that whole project is oligarchy, plutocracy, the leveraging of economic power and political power. So that's the struggle we're in. And the good news is we're going to win it, at least in America, and we'll be able to pass those laws that Brazil has, and we'll be able to have attorney generals like you who can actually prosecute those laws. Because right now we can't because of our Supreme Court. So we'll get that constitutional amendment, and I'll stop there and look forward to much more conversation. So thank you very much.
Any specific decisions about the U.S. legal system that aren't for broader discussion that anybody wants to raise right now, or any of these specific constitutional cases, and then we'll come back to a broader discussion later. Okay. Any questions about comparative context, or no? Because I think you went through it very well.
Yeah. I'll ask a question. So what is the process? You mentioned resolutions being put forth in Congress, but then there's also states that you're trying to get to move the question towards Congress. So can you just explain how that?
Sure. It's a bit of a strategy question Doug has. It's like, okay, you need 2/3 of Congress. Why are we getting state resolutions now? And the reason is, this is how amendments work, that the Congress that you have is the one that got there in the system you're trying to change, right? So the trick of an amendment is always to be out among the people in the states and local communities and changing the Congress into the one that is actually capable of voting 2/3 for dramatic transformation, right? And so the state resolutions aren't, you won't find that in your Constitution in Article 5, but you will find it in every amendment we've had. Going to the states, going to communities, starting local, connecting it up in a networked way of resolving that we demand this, we insist, and then making it have electoral consequences. So we have a candidate, so those 20 states are just the beginning. We're going to get more states calling for this amendment, and there's no magic. If we hit 38 states, it doesn't mean the amendment happens. But it does mean that's how we'll get Congress to do this. And it has to have electoral consequences, so we do that. We have a candidate pledge. We don't want anyone running for office in America eventually to not to be able to avoid answering, do you support a constitutional amendment to have limits on the role of money in our political system so that the people can be represented and heard. Nobody should get to run if they don't answer that question, yes or no. And so we now have 13 of the presidential candidates have taken the American Promise Pledge, and some of them are very big ones, like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie and Mayor Pete, who says, and said in one of the debates, Pete, somebody say his last name for me? Buttigieg. Thank you. So I say Mayor Pete. Says, the question, constitutional amendment, that's so hard. There's got to be something better root. And he said, in America, you may know, our distinguished friends from other nations, we had an experiment in prohibiting alcohol that took a constitutional amendment back in the 1920s, and then we repealed that with another constitutional amendment. So Mayor Pete said, it's hard, are you kidding me? We didn't want to drink, so we passed a constitutional amendment. Then we wanted to drink again, so we passed another constitutional amendment. Don't tell me we can't pass a constitutional amendment to save our democracy. And I think that really summed it up well. So we've entered the political debate at the presidential level. Some of you may not know there's a presidential primary on the Republican side. Bill Weld, former governor of Massachusetts, is running in New Hampshire and elsewhere. He signed the pledge yesterday, a couple days ago now. So we want to have thousands of candidates signing this pledge. I hope you'll check it out at AmericanPromise.net, you Connecticut voters, and get your candidates to sign the pledge. So that's how we do it. That there's hundreds of thousands of people out there, American Promise members, all 50 states. That's how we're going to get Congress to do it. So that's that strategy.
So the actual act of creating an amendment, at least one way to do it, is to bring it up as a resolution in Congress and pass it before it.
All 27 amendments, yes, the joint resolution, House and Senate, passed by 2/3, and then it goes through the legislatures of 38 states to get ratified. All the stuff we're doing is to make that happen by the vote in 2023, ratification by 2026. And if you're skeptical about this idea that you actually get a Congress that's elected under a bad system to actually do this huge work for a better system, think about the men and women, but many women who fought for the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, and those who saw the corruption of senators who were appointed. Senators didn't used to be elected in America. They were appointed at the state level, and it was completely dominated by money and corruption. And so, those are two constitutional amendments. Women vote, and we elect senators, and it came around about the same time. We did 4 amendments between 1910 and 1920. So if you were a woman trying to get the right to vote, or an American at all who wanted a less corrupt system to elect senators, you had to have a strategy that would get an unelected, all-male Senate of mostly plutocrats to do this, right? So how did they do it? An all-male, unelected Senate, dominated by money, voted not for 1 amendment, not for 2 amendments, but for 3 amendments you never would have guessed. Women vote, we elect senators, and we have a progressive income tax. How did that happen? It's a systemic strategy that changed the Senate in 1919 from the one that existed in 1950. And I carry an article around from the New Republic. I don't actually have it, so I don't really carry it around. It's on my phone. 1915, the New Republic, the women fighting for the 19th Amendment were doing a state-based strategy like we are. They lost in 4 states that November. Up before the voters, should women vote? Voters said no. Mostly men voters, no, women shouldn't vote. They lost in 4 states. The article is about how this is ridiculous, it's going nowhere. An amendment, are you kidding? Americans don't want it. It's going to ruin, our way of life. 4 years later, it was ratified and part of the Constitution. That's how fast this tipping point strategy can work. So, I hope you'll join us. We look forward to working with our friends and fellow citizens of the world to get anti-corruption and democracy in all of our countries. So, yeah.
Do we have time for that?
I think we'll go to 1. If you want, is it a quick question about?
Yes, yeah. That, but you can definitely tell me to shut up and we'll talk about it later in the roundtable. But I have two questions. First of all, this was breathtaking. And I'm very active in the Citizens United, and I still haven't heard anybody present it the way you did. So I really must
Thank you.
say.
Go to AmericanPromise.net, that's how we work.
Okay, I have two questions, and they relate in a way to what we heard in the morning. But one is the very, very childish question, perhaps. What is this money being used for? In other words, when you give $1,000 or $10,000 or $1 million for an election campaign, I can think of media costing money. I can think of organization. But millions of dollars of what? So it's a very technical thing. But that's why where I think of corruption, the money is going somewhere else too. I don't know where. So that's a very technical question. The deeper, well, I shouldn't say deeper by myself, but the I think more substantial question is the following. When we heard about Brazil, there was a feeling that in Brazil things are explicit, whereas here they're implicit. At least I use that. And in philosophy, there's a big mantra about making it explicit. So in Brazil, it seems like things are explicit and you have to fight it. Whereas here, it's implicit. We have Citizens United, which is a Supreme Court decision. Who really knows what it says, as you just explained? And I think maybe what you've emphasized, that it's not a matter of explicitness and implicitness, but systemic. That there's something here about that corruption which is deeply systemic. There's something very wrong with the system. And I'm wondering if that would be a better way to say it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I agree. I think it is a systemic issue, systemic corruption that we're particularly dealing with. And it's been caused by, as I said, the modification of the constitutional DNA. So we need a systemic solution to address this systemic problem. But on your first question, I was talking to a congressman last week from upstate in Michigan who said, I'll tell you where the money goes. So I spend 40% of my time raising money. He looked at us and he said, if you had an employee who did their job 60% of the time, you would fire them, right? But he says, I do my job 60% of the time. The rest of the time, I'm raising money. And he said 80% of that goes to media and consultants. And the consultants get a big piece of the media buy. There's a massive political industrial complex now that's built up with getting literally billions of dollars of media buys and percentages of that. And a lot of that media buy is now moving over to digital and Facebook and other sources and hyper-targeted. And that's what's driving the polarization so badly. As we know, they don't even need to tell the truth. So a lot of that money, imagine billions of dollars of propaganda and lies that are explicitly used to divide us and make us hate each other so that you are motivated to go and stop the evil thing on the other side. A lot of the money is going into that, and it's not only corrupting our political process, it's literally corrupting our minds as civic actors, I think. So that's my short answer to where the money goes.
Can we come back to this? So this is what the discussion is going to be related. I want to make sure we get to the other side of your question.
What's the limit of the amendment?
So I was literally, those two sections, I was literally reading from the language. Because
The thing is, so you would like to prevent people, company, corporations to give money, I mean.
yeah, so they,
What do you want?
so the language, we have Congress for the federal legislative body, and 50 states that have their own elections and their own rules. So right now, none of our elected officials are allowed to pass laws to limit this money. We're not allowed to limit money from corporations because the Supreme Court says that violates our First Amendment. This amendment says Congress and the states have the power to pass those laws, to have limits. So we could say zero corporate money to influence the outcome of elections. Not allowed. And we used to do that.
But not to create a public funding, a fund for.
Well, some states may choose, like Connecticut did, to have public-funded elections. And after the amendment, they could say, we don't want any private
Let's
money.
create the other problems that we are facing.
Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, no, so the amendment,
Problems when we forbidden about corporations giving money. We did that 2 or 3 years ago. So now we have billions of reais muchos billions of dollars being created by the Congress to cut the funding.
Yeah, so that's a conversation, a policy choice. The amendment doesn't make that policy choice. The amendment says we have the power to decide what works and what doesn't. So we could, instead of like Sheldon Adelson or Tom Steyer, those are billionaires on each side who spend over $100 million in elections. We could have limits and say, no, everybody has a maximum of $500. And you don't have a right to spend $100 million. After the amendment, we can pass laws saying that. They can go spend $100 million and build Yale, a nice building, or buy a car or whatever, buy a spaceship. That's what they all do now, the billionaires. They want to go to Mars, so they can do that. They can't buy elections after. That's what the amendment does. And I'm sure there'll always be
around the table.
yeah, I look forward to the discussion and the comparative. I'm sure we can learn from what you do. And